Thank you, Marian, and thank you everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to speak to you about my thesis work. So when I say thesis, I should say, when I say that, people assume I mean, uh, sorry, the word is escaping me right now, PhD thesis, but this is actually an undergraduate thesis. So when I come from a planning background, which is essentially urban design, so how cities are built and designed. So when I was going through my undergrad, I was starting to think about how cities actually impact um, how it intersects with climate change, and I wanted to start to look at how the homeless play into that as well. And so I had to kind of bring together these three different realms: homelessness, climate change, and vulnerability. And I have the definitions there, but essentially, I'm sure you're all very familiar with what climate change means and probably familiar with homelessness. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is that homelessness is the structural and systematic issue that manifests as a form of social exclusion from housing, and that also compounds with existing vulnerabilities. So the potential to be adversely affected by things like climate change. So often when I start to talk about my work, people are like, okay, I can start to see how these things sort of overlap and come together, but what does this actually mean? So that's why we have this table right here. So what it means is that the existing vulnerabilities of homeless persons, so lack of access to resources, exposure to the elements, et cetera, those align closely with the climate change impacts, particularly in Halifax, because I was focusing on HRM in my study. Um, so essentially, homeless persons are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, but they're vulnerable in the way that everybody else is, except to an exponential degree of severity. And the thing is, it is happening now. So I really wanted to dig into this with my research, and I was essentially asking these two questions. So we know this is a thing, but are nonprofit organizations and HRM responding to this issue? And if so, how are they doing it? And then what are the barriers and opportunities for those community organizations and HRM to actually address these vulnerabilities now and in the future? And so what I found through looking at all of these documents and talking to people from HRM and nonprofits was that HRM had more of a focus on climate change than homelessness. It actually wasn't mentioned in their documents, but they did talk a bit about hazards, risks, and vulnerability. And keep in mind, this is March last year, so before Halifax 2050 came out. And with HRM, they were talking more from an environmental and economic lens compared to nonprofit organizations where they focused more on extreme weather preparation and the relationship between housing and homelessness. And this was repeated in the interviews that I had as well. There was common conversation about housing vulnerability, the opportunity for action and collaboration. But again, with the nonprofits, they were talking about homelessness, extreme weather, responding to that, and poverty. And there wasn't really a clear direction on where to go with it. Versus HRM, they were talking a lot about climate change, a bit about emergency, a bit about community services. And they were interested in getting involved and providing aid, but they weren't really sure where to go. And so these quotes at the bottom here, they really sum up for me what I was hearing at the time. And this is pre-COVID when I was collecting these statements. So for nonprofits, it's hard to fight for tomorrow when the clients we work for are fighting for today. And to me, that is so crystallizing, if that makes sense, because I was talking to service providers who were helping these individuals get through day to day, and they were already starting to respond to some of the issues that we're seeing. So heat preparation, cold mitigation, stuff like this. But they're also recognizing that in this everyday struggle, it's hard to look at that long term. Whereas HRM recognized that this is a vulnerable population, and that they need to be extra cognizant of it, but they weren't really sure how to approach responding to that. So overall, what I found, and I am going fairly quickly, there will be time for questions at the end. What I found was that HRM's policies and programs do not directly address the vulnerability of homeless persons to climate change. However, their plans do address climate change and emergency management, and even more so now that we have Halifax 2050. Meanwhile, nonprofits are responding to the climate vulnerabilities of homeless persons through extreme weather preparation. So again, providing sunscreen this summer, hats, and then in the winter, trying to mitigate the effects of cold, trying to make sure they have housing and food and stuff like this. So they are doing it now, but their policies don't actually recognize that and seek to address it systematically. And then in terms of barriers, there was a lack of knowledge and resources. So nonprofits often, at least the nonprofits I spoke to, often didn't have a clear understanding of the um, mechanics behind climate change and what that means.
Mm.
While opportunities were the existing programs and policies and the need, and sorry, not the need, the interest in collaboration from both sides. So at the end of all of this, so just as COVID was really ramping up and I was trying to pull together all of this information last winter, I was starting to think about what can we do about this? And I was looking at it from the lens of what can HRM as a local government do? What can nonprofits do? And what can the Housing and Homelessness Partnership do to work together to address these? And I was also looking at short-term solutions as well as long-term changes, because as you know, with climate change, we can respond to it in the short term, but it's nothing, we need to keep that long range vision in mind. So I had three main recommendations, and originally, again, these were made, last year, just as COVID was really ramping up, or beginning, I should say. Um, so I'm going to present the recommendations as I originally had them, and then I'm going to add a little bit more based on what we've learned over the last year or so. The first one is really that short-term focus. Recognize that homeless persons are highly vulnerable to climate change now. It's not in 5 years, it's not in 10 years, it's actually happening now. And we need to acknowledge those vulnerabilities in the guiding documents that we have, while also sharing knowledge within and between organizations. So that way we can build that community awareness and knowledge, but also keeping in mind that it's not just homeless persons who are vulnerable. They are one of many populations that will and are affected by climate change. And to that end, with COVID, we're seeing the need for housing become more and more clear. And so we need to take the lessons that we've learned so far um, to start to prepare for the next COVID, if you will, the next infectious disease, because with climate change, those are expected to become more prominent. And frankly, it would be irresponsible not to start planning for them. Uh, and when I say planning, I don't mean we're going to have a hard and fast plan. Obviously, it's going to be everything's going to change, but we should be looking at the lessons we learned so that we, for the next event, we have some direction to go from. The second one was actually going to these people, the people with lived experience of homelessness and by extension poverty, to actually explore how climate change affects them. If you recall that table I had at the beginning of how climate change relates to the existing vulnerabilities, that's a very academic way of looking at it. Whereas if I was to go up to somebody and ask them, how do you experience this? How does climate change affect you? They might not have an answer for me, because it's very hard to understand how that applies in your everyday life. So with this recommendation, I was trying to get at that difficult way of kind of explaining things, because you could talk about this in the sense of what are the challenges you face in your everyday life? And for example, that might be obviously not having shelter, but say on the really cold nights, like lack of knowledge of where to go for shelter, for example, or inability to get sunscreen, hats, water, whatever it may be. Like, this is the realm that I haven't been able to find a lot of information in. And if we're going to start to find solutions, the people with that lived experience need to be involved in ways that are appropriate to them. And it needs to be focused on tangible solutions that make an impact now, essentially. And if you like, I can send around my actual thesis document after, where I go a little bit more into what those opportunities would actually look like. So focus groups, community-based research, participatory mapping, all this stuff. But it's also, now that we're looking at COVID, you're seeing more people sleeping outside, more people becoming homeless, and essentially the situation is actively worsening and those needs are shifting. So there needs to be a discourse on if this is going to happen, if people are actually going to approach homeless persons and start this conversation, how can you do it in a way that's ethical and responsive to their needs, especially as this situation is gradually, I'm not sure about gradually, getting worse. It could be rapidly getting worse. And the third and final, is establish policies and plans for long-term mitigation and adaptation to climate change and homelessness. So recognizing that both climate change and homelessness, not hopelessness, are systematic issues that have very complex um, factors leading into them, and there's no easy solutions for each, but hopefully by recognizing their interconnectedness, we can start to find some opportunities to address them concurrently. So for example, one of the things that I proposed was actually doing energy retrofits on shelters. So not only reducing energy waste and making those buildings greener, but also reducing hopefully the upkeep cost on them. So therefore helping that organization to continue its work. So there are these opportunities here that can serve multiple purposes if we start to look at them. And then actually having those plans and policies in place for change. And that's where, as advocacy groups, we need to start looking at the Halifax 2050 plan and the baseline report that the plan is based off of, to make sure that the needs of not just homeless persons, but other vulnerable groups, so people with potentially disabilities, seniors, all of these different groups, that their needs are actually met in it. Because it's one thing to say the homeless are particularly vulnerable to climate change now, but it's another thing to actually have policies in place that are going to address that. So for me, it's moving beyond the recognition of that vulnerability and actually looking at how we can change it. So with that in mind, I want to leave you with two thoughts spread over two different slides. The first one starts to look at, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Final thoughts. Yes. Okay. So these are two quotes that I pulled out from the conversations I had with HRM staff. So climate change and homelessness both seem like such big, unsolvable issues that are so giant, so it can seem kind of daunting to try and take a stab at one of them, let alone both together. So for me, that really shows just how big these issues are that we're dealing with, and it's normal to feel overwhelmed by all of this. But as the second person says in that quote, we have less than a decade at this point to turn things around, and we just need to start somewhere. It may not be perfect, but it's something. And to that end, I've been actually working with the Nudge Global Impact Challenge. It's a sustainability leadership program. And essentially, you come in with an idea and they help you develop it over the course of a year. So what I'm currently working on is trying to get people together to actually talk about some of these issues. So not just homeless vulnerability and climate change, but just climate vulnerability in general. Like, what are the populations that are most affected by this? And that would be the educational webinars. But all of this would be leading to a big one-day event where we get people from different backgrounds, different specialties, people with lived experience together to actually talk about these things. Because again, huge issues, difficult to find solutions to. And personally, I believe the only way that we're going to start to even plot a cohesive path forward is to talk to people together. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'd like to open up the floor to talk about that idea. Is something like this, where people get together, something your group would be interested in? Is there another way that might be more effective? I'm just generally looking for thoughts and feedback right now as I start to plan this out. Thank you.
Wow, that's incredible.
Which part?
All of it, really. There's so much to it too. So
Yes.
do people have any thoughts, or is there anything you'd like to say in regards to the topic and what Brianna has been doing? Yes, Stella.
Hi, Brianna. We've talked on the phone. I can't see you. Oh, there you are, right underneath me. Yeah, I'd certainly like to talk to you about your idea of bringing groups together. I think I mentioned to you, I work with on advocacy around income, not so much homelessness, although it's a growing part of the problem, because more and more people on income assistance are becoming homeless, and it's a real worry. But I also some years ago did some work with a women's group on climate change and women, in terms of its specific effects on women. So I'll certainly send you that document. But I'd certainly be interested in talking to you about how we might address the core issue around really poverty and homelessness, I would say, because a lot of people living in poverty, especially on income assistance, simply don't have the money to buy sunscreen or a sun hat or whatever, right? So it is a problem. And I don't know whether it's related. We tried to talk to the public health about this, but there's a big bed bug problem in low-income housing in Nova Scotia, especially in Halifax. And public health will not regard this as a health issue. But there has been some suggestion that this is also linked to climate change. And I don't know what your opinion of that might be. You probably need to talk to who are these people that do study insects? Is it etymologists or something like that?
It sounds right.
Anyway, but there are issues like that as well. That and of course the housing where people in poverty live are often they wouldn't have air conditioners, or often not well ventilated and so on. So anyway, I'll just leave it there, but we'll talk again about this. Thanks very much.
I look forward to it. And in terms of the bed bugs, I have not heard anything about that. It seems probable, just with like the changing temperatures allowing different sorts of bugs to move into different areas. But that is not my background, so I don't want to.
Well, when I worked with this women's group, which was the CFUW, Canadian Federation of University Women, we did a project actually leading up to the Copenhagen conference, and it had resolutions on women and climate change, but it could apply to any people who are vulnerable in some way. We had a woman who teaches at Dow. I think she does a lot of work on this kind of thing, insects and that. So she did provide us some information about, how we know that, for example, deer ticks are moving north because of climate change and other things, right? So some people are likely more vulnerable to some of those things than others. Anyway, I'll leave it there and let others have their say. I'm sure there's lots of people who want to speak. Thank you.